a hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 159 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this early Thursday evening here in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, enjoy the content, but haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. So today is the 101st anniversary of Yankee Stadium, the original iteration of which opened for business on April 18th, 1923. Now, the Yankees, way back in the day, in the late 19th century, they played at something called Hilltop Park. They were known as the New York Highlanders. And then around the turn of the century and going forward, they played at what was known as the Polo Grounds, which was where the New York baseball giants played their home games. And the Yankees started to build their own stadium. I think they broke ground in 1920. I'm not 100% sure on that. But the arrival of Babe Ruth certainly helped. Babe Ruth got there before the 1920 season, and the team immediately became a contender. And they went to the World Series, oddly enough, against the New York baseball giants, managed by the legendary, iconic John McGraw. And the Yankees dropped the 1921 and 1922 World Series to the New York baseball giants, despite the best efforts of Babe Ruth, who by that point was just tearing everything up, just crushing the ball, hitting tons of homers, 59 homers, 54 homers. Wasn't pitching anymore. He was just too valuable. His bat was too valuable. And this is something the Angels with Shohei Ohtani and Dodgers now. And what do you do with this guy? 101 years ago today. And it's not really an irony, but the sort of wacky thing is Yankee Stadium was state of the art. That ballpark that opened on April 18, 1923, they had more parking than any of the earlier ballparks because more and more people were driving. There were amenities, food options that hadn't existed at previous parks. The seats weren't cramped together to the same extent. Well, nowadays it would have appeared cramped, but for the time when most people were used to sitting on uncomfortable benches and being pressed together and not necessarily having that great view of a field, they figured out a lot of things from the kind of surveyor standpoint, figure out, okay, we can't have a pole here because then you will have an obstructed view. These are the kinds of things. Yeah, they hired some pretty smart people to put this together. So having their own ballpark, I don't know if that's even how or part of the reason why they ended up winning the World Series in their first year of the new ballpark. But there's so much history and so many things that you say, well, this can't have happened like that. That's just too perfect. The Yankees' opponent on that first day, the first series, were the Boston Red Sox. The team whose owner, Harry Frazee, had stupidly sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees for what amounted to a mortgage on Fenway Park so that he could produce a Broadway musical, No, Nanette. On that particular day, April 18, 1923, at Old Yankee Stadium, Babe Ruth hit a 3-run homer off of Howard Emke of the Red Sox. Good pitcher. Ended up winning 166 games over 13 seasons and even briefly held the World Series record for most strikeouts in a single game. Howard Emke, E-H-M-K-E, Emke. Great name. Babe hit a home run against the Red Sox to beat the Red Sox, the team that he was traded from to go to the Yankees. The first game, he beats them. It's just too perfect. So the Yankees won. They ended up winning the 1923 World Series, and Babe Ruth's stat line in 1923 is insanity. He had 393, 41 homers, 130 RBIs, and 170 walks, which is another way of saying if they had pitched to him, he might have hit 60 home runs that year instead of having to wait 4 years. He might have knocked in closer to 200 runs. 170 walks in a 154-game season. Complete ridicularity. So with their ballpark behind them and everyone loving the stadium, from fans to visiting journalists, just people getting to be at the ballpark, the Yankees went to the World Series in 1926, lost. The late, great Grover Cleveland Alexander, phenomenal pitcher, ended up playing a kind of key role in the Yankees losing that World Series. But then in 1927, Babe Ruth broke his own home run record. He had 60 home runs in 1927. He out-homered at least 3/4 of the teams by himself. And this is where the old school historians such as myself will always argue tooth and nail that comparing any modern day baseball player from Shohei Ohtani on down, Mike Trout, it's ridiculous because nobody did what Babe Ruth did. From a conceptual standpoint, it's impossible. They were in the dead ball era. Nobody could hit home runs. Babe out-homered like 9 or 10 teams, if not more, that year by himself. The entire team. That would be the equivalent of a baseball team hitting 140 home runs today. Aaron Judge would have to hit 141 by himself. It ain't happening. That is how much greater, how much more dominating Babe Ruth was than anyone. You can't even quantify what I'm saying. There is nothing to compare that to. So 1927 Yankees, they won 110 games. They went 110 and 54. And the joke is, how did they even lose that many games as 44? Babe had an incredible year. Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse, right in the middle of his prime. He hit 47 home runs. He out-homered about 7 teams on his own. They won the World Series again in 1928. And they kind of dipped a little bit. The Philadelphia A's won 1929, 30, 31. That they took the American League in those years, and the Yankees didn't make it. Babe got one more World Series, 1932. But the most famous moment from that World Series, which the Yankees ended up winning relatively easily, it didn't take place at Yankee Stadium. Babe Ruth called his shot. He didn't call his shot. He was probably pointing at someone in the stands. But Babe Ruth called his shot. They won the World Series in 1932. Babe got old, and even though Gehrig was still in his prime, DiMaggio was a few years away, and the great teams of the late 20s, the players had gotten older, guys like Whitey Witt and Bob Musial. They got older. The new regime came in, and this is something that the Yankee franchise, they had the magic. When one great player got a little older, there was another all-timer to replace them. Babe Ruth and then Lou Gehrig, and Lou started to, he didn't really slow down. Nobody knew he was going to get sick. But Gehrig's still in the absolute prime. Here comes Joe DiMaggio, Joltin' Joe, for decades, the greatest living ball player. Could argue that Joe is top 5 greatest players in the history of the sport. That was a guy who did everything well. He even ran fast when he was younger. Joltin' Joe DiMaggio. So behind Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio, the Yankees won the World Series 1936, 1937, and then Gehrig declined in 38 because he was dying. But they won the World Series in 1939 without Larry bin Lou. They won the World Series in 1941 and 1942 and then went off to war. Joe DiMaggio, Ted Williams. Joe came back. They won the World Series in 1947. They beat the Brooklyn Dodgers for the second time. They had beaten them in 1941. Famous series. The Dodgers were going to tie the series. Mickey Owen. Tommy Henrich struck out. Mickey Owen couldn't find the ball. Tommy Henrich made it to first. The Yankees had a big rally, and they wrapped up the World Series the next day. That's baseball, Susan. The Yankees then won 5 consecutive World Series. 1949, they beat the Dodgers. 1950, they beat Philadelphia. 1951, they beat their old rivals and former housemates, the New York Giants, who had come back from 13 games down late in the year to overtake the Brooklyn Dodgers on still the most famous home run in baseball history in the third game of a 3-game playoff because the Dodgers and Giants had finished tied in the standings. Bobby Thompson off Ralph Branca hit a home run to put the Giants in the World Series. The Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. Well, they won the pennant, but the Yankees won the World Series in 1951. And then in 1952, they beat the Dodgers again. And in 1953, they beat the Dodgers again. And many of those World Series clinching games took place at the big ballpark in the Bronx. But then in 1955, the Dodgers finally won one. Finally. In 56, the Yanks got him one last time. And then the Dodgers and Giants moved west, leaving the Bronx Bombers as the only baseball team in New York for 5 years until the New York Metropolitans came on the scene in 1962. And where did they play? They played at the Polo Grounds until their new stadium was going to be ready, what would become Shea Stadium. The Yankees of 1961, now that's a magical year, another magical year. You hate to say that the Yankee ballpark made it possible for players like Roger Maris, who ended up hitting 61 home runs, to hit that many homers. But Yankee Stadium as a field, overall, it was considered a pitcher's park. You had a short right field, very short. It was about 296 down the line. Didn't take much to get it out of there. But the power alleys were deep. Left center and center was insanely deep. And it's one reason why Joe DiMaggio, in addition to the fact that he lost 3 full years when he would have been in his prime due to military service, DiMaggio, as a strong right-handed hitter, couldn't hit a home run to the power alleys. He was lucky to even get the ball over the outfielder's head. They were playing him so deep. Think of the difference between left center field power alleys at 400 feet versus 456 feet. The field was so big, the monuments were on the field. Say that again. The monuments were on the field. Miller Huggins, Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth. I think Jacob Rupert may have had a monument. The monuments were on the field. You would hit a ball 430 feet in the air, and Mickey Mantle would joke around that sometimes the ball would go over his head and he would have to fish it out from in between Miller Huggins and Babe Ruth. Oh, here's the ball. Throw it back to the infield. It's exactly what happened. That is how deep the field was. They didn't even bother to put the monuments behind the fence. Well, nobody can hit it out here anyway. So the 1961 Yankees, I believe they won 109 games. That was the year of the home run chase between Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris. They were both chasing Babe Ruth. And the controversy, because Babe Ruth had hit 60 home runs in an 154-game season, and now it was a 162 game season. And Roger Maris, not a true Yankee. An interloper. Well, what's going to happen if he breaks the record? Well, we're just going to have to put an asterisk next to it because unless he does it in 154 games, it's not fair to the memory of the Babe. Maris hit 61 in 61, hitting the final home run in the last game of the season at Yankee Stadium. He even called him out for a curtain call. Weren't a ton of people there that day, which is bizarre given what he was trying to do. But Mantle had gotten sick, he had some issues, and he kind of stalled out. He ended up at 54 homers. The Yankees won that World Series. It looks like they won it going away, but they were in trouble. And Roger Maris, who did not have a good World Series, he hit a tie-breaking homer in the ninth inning of what I want to say was Game 3. I think it was Game 3. And then they ended up, I don't think they lost any more games in that series. Then they won the 1962 World Series. Oh, I forgot to point out, the 1960 World Series was a fucking disaster. They lost to a Pittsburgh Pirates team, which really was not very good, in a Game 7 that they had won repeatedly and then punted it away. Very, very bad. They went back to the World Series in 1963 and 64. In 63, they got swept by their now arch rival Los Angeles Dodgers and the unhittable Sandy Koufax. And in 64, 7-game series, Bob Gibson, the extraordinary, one of the great pitchers in the history of baseball. At least they took him to 7, and they lost. Now, up until this point in time, the hallowed grounds of Yankee Stadium, there had always been, starting with the Babe, one all-timer to replace another all-timer. You had Babe, and then Gehrig, and then DiMaggio. And DiMaggio's last year was 51. He wasn't very old, but Joe's body was shot. By the time he was 35, he was pretty much done. Here comes Mickey Mantle. The Commerce Comet. The Mick. Another one of the greatest baseball players who ever lived. He was a guy who didn't quite live up to his talent because he was always drunk. He never stopped drinking. That he achieved what he did shows you how otherworldly the talent level of the Commerce Comet was. He was thought to be the fastest man in baseball, and he could hit the ball 550 feet. Mantle was such a freak that he hit home runs distances that Mark McGwire did not reach, even though he was twice the size. Mantle had hands and wrists and forearm strength that was about 3 times what it should have been for a man his size. He was built like a normal guy. Mickey would have been smaller than Derek Jeter by today's standards, but he had strength that was proportionally idiotic. But Mick started to slow down, and the Yankee franchise went into the toilet. And the great old ballpark in the Bronx emptied out. And from 1964 through 1973, they had a couple of winning seasons. But they never really got close to postseason play. They had one year they won, I want to say they won 93 games, but the Baltimore Orioles, I think, won 111. So they were nowhere. Nowadays, that Yankee team would have gotten to the postseason. They probably would have, hosted a wild card game or whatever it might have been. But they're definitely making a postseason. 93 wins today, you're getting there. But the season was over in May. The Orioles ran away with it. So at the end of 1973, that's the last year they played in the old ballpark. New owner George Steinbrenner managed to get things together, and George was a very young man at the time. He was in his early 40s. The Yankee Doodle Dandy himself, George Steinbrenner, born on July 4th. They broke ground on, it was always mistakenly referred to as the new stadium. What they did was they remodeled and retrofitted using the existing shell of the original building. They rebuilt on top of what was already there. So it was kind of a new stadium, but at the same time, it was kind of not a new stadium. The Yankees played in the, forgive me, Mets fans, the graveyard of Shea Stadium for 2 years. Now, 1974, They got real close. They got to the last couple of days of the season. They needed to win out, and they didn't do it. But they at least had the first pennant race year since '64. So the franchise under George, even though he had some issues, he could have gone to prison. He'd made illegal campaign contributions to Nixon, just really dumb stuff, like stupid mistakes. He was lucky it wasn't worse. So he was kind of sidelined from the baseball for a time. But the team was moving in the right direction. The young players, Thurman Munson, guys like that were growing up and had grown up within the organization. And then key trades and getting guys like Sparky Lyle and Mickey Rivers. So by the time the new stadium opened, or what was called the new stadium, Yankee Stadium 2, if you prefer, by the time the stadium reopened in 1976, and again, the ballpark was state of the art. You look at pictures of that stadium from the early part of the 1976 season, and you'll say, I can't believe this picture is 50 years old. It looks like I could walk in there right now. That is how modern Yankee Stadium 2 appeared. So once more, in the first year of a new stadium, the Yankees had a huge season. They went over 100 wins, and they got to the World Series. They defeated the Kansas City Royals in a thrilling championship series. And back then, only 4 teams made the playoffs in all of Major League Baseball. American League East, American League West, National League East, National League West. And a championship series wasn't even best out of 7. It was best out of 5. We were at Game 3. The Yankees ended up winning Game 3. We were at Game 3. I was 2 years old. And I know there is a picture of me holding a cup of beer, but it sadly has been lost to history. But Game 5 of that series, and this is something to Google, Chris Chambliss hit a walk-off home run in the bottom of the 9th. The Yankees had led and seemed to have the game in hand, and a magnificent, very young at the time, George Brett, tied the game in the 8th inning with a 3-run homer. And Yankee fans, we hadn't won a World Series in 14 years, hadn't sniffed the playoffs in a dozen years practically, hadn't been to the playoffs in a dozen years, and then there was a doom and gloom, the foreboding in that ballpark. Everyone who was there said it. We are going to lose this fucking game. And the Yankees survived a very tense top of the 9th inning, sudden death. The Royals score in the 9th, the Yanks have 3 outs, they don't score, they're on the golf course the next day. When Chris Chambliss hit a walk-off, first pitch he saw from Mark Littell. And the announcer, one of the announcers in the booth was Reggie Jackson, who the word was going to sign with the Yankees. And Reggie had an incredible moment when he saw Chris Chambliss. It was a chilly night, and he had his shirt as open as you could have it. And Reggie said, man, Chris Chambliss is so hot. Look at how he has his shirt. Boom. Chambliss homers. Howard Cosell's famous call, Chris Chambliss has won the American League pennant for the New York Yankees. And you know that Reginald Martinez Jackson, watching literally thousands of fans stream onto the field, the crazy level of pandemonium. Chambliss couldn't even touch home plate. He nearly killed some guy on his way. He was trying to get to the clubhouse, and he ran over some guy. He just fucking decked him. It was like Jim Brown running over a safety. But Reginald Martinez Jackson, he knew he wanted to be a Yankee already, but seeing the ballpark go this fucking crazy, sold. So unfortunately, the 1976 New York Yankees did not win the championship that year. They got swept out of the World Series by the Cincinnati Reds and the Big Red Machine of Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan. But Reggie did in fact sign with the Yankees. And in the 1977 season, the ballpark played host to the first winning World Series in 15 years. And the final game, Reggie Jackson hit 3 home runs to lock up the World Series. Arguably the greatest individual performance in that kind of setting in the history of team sports. That's a fun argument to have. Then they repeated as champs the next year in 78. They had a lot of big teams. 1980, won over 100 games. The Royals swept them out of the playoffs. 1981, split season, strike year. They make it to the World Series. Dodgers beat them in 6. And then the dark times, the fall of the empire. The Yankees did not go back to the postseason for 14 years. It was 14 years until the great old ballpark came to life again. And then they won 4 World Series in the old park under Joe Torre from 1996 to 2000. And the 2000 World Series was the last for the Yankees. So the last World Series where the Yankees clinched at home, because they didn't clinch, they ended up clinching Game 5 against the Mets at Shea Stadium. 1998 was their last clinching World Series win at home. It's 25 years ago. And the Yanks had a lot of big teams throughout the 2000s. They made the World Series in 2003. They went over 100 wins a bunch of times. But in the mid-2000s, after a lot of hedging and back and forth and fighting with city planners and arguing, we're going to move out of New York, we're going to move to the city, we're going to tear down the park, Steinbrenner kind of compromised. I don't know that he ever was really serious about moving. The idea was they could build a stadium near the West Side Rail Yards in Manhattan. I would have rather they had done that and left the old ballpark in the Bronx as a museum or something. They didn't do that. They took down the old park piece by piece. And they broke ground. I think they broke ground on a new stadium in 2006. And the new stadium opened, new Yankee Stadium, in 2009. And what did they do? The first year in the new stadium, they went to the World Series, and then they actually won the World Series. That's 15 years ago. And that's the last time the Yankees have won a World Series. Even though a lot of big teams, a lot of playoff runs, but no World Series wins. Because the reality of baseball is that the playoffs are a gigantic crapshoot. Yes, the better team has the advantage, but as somebody who watched all of the Joe Torre era, but particularly the championship run, they had fairy dust sprinkled on them. They could have lost the first series to Texas. They got incredibly lucky in that series. Then they got lucky in the Baltimore series, the Jeffrey Mayer play. They probably would have lost the first game. And in 1998, even in 98, they got a number of breaks. And in 99, everything seemed to go right. Whenever they needed a hit, they get a bloop hit. The other team would hit a smash right at somebody. They got really lucky. And 4 World Series in 5 years with all the layers of playoffs. See, that's the thing. The early days when they were winning World Series 4 at a time, 5 at a time, there were no playoffs. The first place in the American League played the first place in the National League in the World Series. So as dominant as many of those Yankee teams were, if they had to play another layer of playoffs, some of them would have gotten beat. In a best of 5 or, especially even a best of 7, they would have had a better chance, but they would not have won all of those World Series. An extra layer of playoffs, you can lop off at least 1 from 36 to 39, and at least 1 and maybe 2 from 49 to 53. It's much more difficult. It was miraculous that they won 4 in 5 years. It's miraculous. But it is true that I miss the old ballpark. For people who don't know, for people who never had the opportunity, to go to that park, I got to attend a number of playoff games. I never went to any famous playoff games. I'm the guy who would go to the game before the famous game. When I was 2 years old, 2 days before Chambliss's famous home run. I went to a game in the 2001 playoffs, the series where Derek Jeter did the shovel pass, the famous shovel pass. But I didn't go to famous game. I was never at any iconic playoff games, unfortunately, even though I attended games in 2002, 2003, 2004. And I went to a postseason game in 99 and went to two of them in 2000. But unfortunately, I can't say, oh, I got to see Bernie Williams' homer that tied game 4 of the, which one? That was in the 2000. It wasn't game 4. It was 2001. It was game 4 in 2001, and the Yanks were up 2-1. That's what it was. And Bernie goes boom. I wasn't at that game. I really didn't get to see any super exciting playoff games. But that's the way it goes. The ballpark made noise unlike what the new park sounds like. And it's not because it's more corporate. Listen, people go fucking nuts, whether or not they're paying $10,000 for a seat or they're a regular person who is just at the game because somebody gave them a ticket. The park doesn't sound the same. It was built differently. The aerodynamics aren't the same. I wish they hadn't ripped down the old park, but they did. So Yankee Stadium, 101 years ago today, the first ballpark from 1923 through 1973. It was host for 51 seasons of baseball. Yankee Stadium 2 was host for 23. 23, what am I doing? What awful math. Dad, I am so sorry. Father was a CPA, and I just shorted 10 years. Horrendous. 33 years of baseball, including the unfortunate 2008 season. The one playoff miss from 1995 through 2012. The one playoff miss was the last year at the house that Ruth built. Oh well. So that park had 33 years, and this park is now, well, it's 15 years ago, so this is the 16th year. The 16th year of the new stadium, which really is a new stadium. They built it across the street. If you're in the same kinds of, like, the view is very similar, but they built it across the street. The only thing left, and this is what I'm going to end on, the only thing left from the old stadium, they kept that gigantic air circulator that looks like a baseball bat. The bat is still there. Everything else, lost to history. And lifetimes of memories for people older than me, in many cases, who saw that ballpark come alive in the 90s, as it had in the 70s, in the early 60s, and before that, from 1923 all the way forward. I mean, from 1923 through 1962, the Yankees won about half of the World Series. You think about that, for a 40-year stretch. I'm going to run through it real quick. 23, 27, 28, 32, 36, 37, 38, 39, 41, 42. That's 10. 47, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 56, 58, 61, 62. They won half of the World Series at the OG Big Ballpark in the Bronx as their home field. The New York Yankees, the greatest franchise in the history of professional sports. 161 River Avenue. Old Yankee Stadium. 101 years ago today. This has been episode 159 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this, yet again, another trip down memory lane for the New York Yankees and that great old ballpark in the Bronx. But if you check out episode 159 on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you check out this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 160 real soon. Till then, the Yankees win! Peace.